Yep, that's right. 6 months ago, on the 4th of August 2019, I uploaded the introduction video where I explained the concept for my game N.E.S.T. It had roughly 1.5 views at the time, but I was determined to turn my vision into a reality. Now half a year later, and I'm still posting videos logging the progress of the game. This week, however, I'm doing something a little different. I thought it would be a nice idea to reflect on what we've managed to achieve in this time, and make a summary of each devlog up until now. This should hopefully give new viewers an entry point into the game's development journey, and also prove to me that I'm actually making progress. On top of that, I'll also reveal the release date for the demo during the video. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. After spending an entire week creating the introduction video, I finally got around to working on the actual game, and began by tackling the core gameplay mechanics. This included basic player actions, such as jumping, crouching, rolling, aiming, etc. However, more importantly, the unique movement system. Here I'm referring to how players move by tilting their phone using the built-in accelerometer. Lastly, I added a couple of placeholder animations into the game, which I'm actually still using to this day. In an attempt to again be different, I created a unique wedge selector system, whereby you press down on the selector, drag your finger above a wedge, and then release to select it. The left wedge selector is for your weapons, and the right is for your consumables. For my game though, I wanted swapping between weapons to feel realistic. I added a progress mechanic to indicate how far you were into selecting, as well as the option to cancel progress made, which was much trickier to implement. Now it was time to work on aiming and shooting. Firstly, I added 2 joysticks, the left for aiming and the right for shooting. For each type of weapon though, the joystick should behave differently. Automatic rifles, for example, are triggered when you hold the joystick down, and single fire rifles are triggered when you release it. I then added a crosshair system, which also included spreading. Next, I implemented a trajectory system, which showed the path throwables would travel along when thrown. A big problem I found with most third-person shooter mobile games were their controls, and so that's why I put having customizable layouts at the top of my to-do list. This included having the ability to enable or disable, move, scale, and change the opacity of each UI element. And after creating this system, as well as a pause menu to access it, I moved on to saving and added the ability to switch between 3 different layouts. This was a bit of a rough week because of my GPU that decided to just give up. But after I sent it back to America to get fixed, I got back to working on the shooting mechanics. This included adding recoil, bullet impacts, and muzzle flashes when you shot, as well as being able to reload your weapons when you ran out of bullets. Fortunately, I had designed the progress system in such a way that allowed me to relatively easily integrate reloading. Lastly, I added placeholder weapons to swap between the different positions on the player's body. Unfortunately, I was again quite busy this week, so I spent a little time I had fixing bugs and adding a few new features, which included, among others, the ability to throw throwables and use consumables. Now, finally back to my normal routine, I got to work and began adding some proper graphics into the game. This referred to the actual character, as well as all of the different weapons, which I decided would follow a low poly art style. Lastly, I obtained all of the different shooting sound effects for each weapon, and sorted them out into different folders. Something I definitely wanted to include was character customization, which meant being able to customize the player's gender, skin color, head, as well as clothing and accessories. I then also added the functionality for the camera to zoom in and out, pan up and down, and rotate around the player. After I had that in place, I began filling in all of the stats for each weapon, which meant having to meticulously copy down the information from each weapon's Wikipedia page into Excel, and then use formulae to calculate values to use in-game. This was when my game started feeling like an actual game, because I added a bunch of enemies into the game, as well as some basic enemy AI. This included wandering, inspecting, and attacking. In short, enemies start wandering at the beginning of each level, and then when a player is thought to be nearby, like if they hear, see, or are damaged by the player, then they start inspecting. If the player is then in their line of sight, they will begin attacking. Now that enemies were in the game, I began working on a system to add melee, ranged, and special attacks to each alien. I then added more behaviors, such as being able to destroy objects in their path, as well as fade away and die when they had run out of health. They also now dropped collectible gold when they died, which is used to purchase and unlock weapons, wearables, and consumables. In order to let aliens take damage, I decided on attaching primitive colliders to each of their body parts. This was for performance reasons, but also because I wanted to add a critical hit mechanic. I then added the ability for aliens to defend against attacks, and added a series of animations when the player died. Next, because I had the attack systems in place from the previous video, I was able to now finish adding the rest of the ranged and special attacks. Lastly, I modeled a few of the low poly consumables using Blender. I started off by implementing the functionality for the consumables I modeled. In short, health items immediately restore health, while boosters regenerate health over time. Next, I added a bunch of melee weapons into the game, and then implemented their functionality. I then improved the AI for aliens with ranged attacks, because they were in fact prioritizing their melee attacks, which didn't make sense. Lastly, I looked into how I would go about creating low poly terrain, which was unfortunately slightly more complicated than I had initially hoped. Now 18 weeks in, I finally decided to create a Discord server, and it's been amazing interacting with all of you on there. I also spoke about the weekly Discord challenges I planned on hosting each week, and I'm glad to say that they have turned out well. Anyway, after I spent some time spring cleaning my game's project files, I re-evaluated the movement system because it had been concerning me for a while. I decided to add an option to disable fixed movement because I felt it definitely restricted the player's movement in a negative way and led to some awkward situations. I then finalized the process for designing levels and then added 8-way directional rolling animations. I then however decided to altogether remove fixed movement and instead replaced it with a more conventional approach, allowing players to use a joystick instead of the accelerometer. Next, I worked on adding completely customizable gesture regions, which are areas that allow players to perform swipe gestures on the screen. The blue region is used for navigating, and the red region is used for performing actions. I then began designing the base camp, which completely replaces the GUI-oriented main menu used in most games. For this, I wanted objects which I modeled in Blender to be interacted with to reveal the different menus. The base camp was coming along nicely, so I finalized the design and then implemented the View Manager system. Next, I animated opening and closing of the supply crates, which use particle effects as well as camera and weapon movement to make receiving items feel more spectacular. I then redesigned the UI for the character customization menu and worked on the weapon rack. For this, I wanted players to be able to view all the available weapons, but also be able to identify which they had unlocked. I ended up using the stencil buffer to achieve the masking effect, and finally added a statistics menu to be shown when players viewed each weapon. With the weapon rack now fully functional, I did the same for the throwables container and consumables cabinet, and ensured that they also displayed the relevant information. I then dealt with how players would equip items, as well as switch between different loadouts. Finally, I added all of the apparel and accessory items into the game, and added functionality to the wearables supply crate. And that brings me to where I currently am at this stage of development. We still have a long way to go, and I'm excited to share the rest of the development process with you. I also look forward to letting you all test the demo, so make sure you've joined the Discord server before then to be included. But that's gonna do it for this video. If you enjoyed or learned something, make sure to slap that like button and subscribe to follow along on the development of this game. Anyway, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.